The life of Elias Vance was a fortress built of glass and steel, impeccably designed and admired by all who saw it from the outside. From his corner office on the 47th floor, the city sprawled beneath him, a grid of frantic energy that he translated into numbers, into profit and loss. He was a master of this universe, a senior financial analyst at 34, with a salary that afforded him a minimalist apartment with panoramic views, a German car that purred with quiet superiority, and relationships that were as neat and transactional as the portfolios he managed. His days were a metronome of precision. 5:30 a.m. alarm, gym, black coffee, a crisp, white shirt, the 7:14 a.m. train, 12 hours of dissecting market trends, of algorithms and high-stakes conference calls where millions were moved with a decisive click. He was good at it. In fact, he was exceptional. He felt the rhythm of the market like a second heartbeat, a pulse of pure, unadulterated logic. There was a certain beauty to it, a cold, hard certainty that left no room for ambiguity. Yet, in the quiet moments, a strange silence would descend. It was in the absence of noise, but the absence of feeling. It happened late at night, staring at the city lights that never slept, a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand. He would look at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window and see a stranger wearing his face. The man in the glass was successful, envied, but his eyes were hollow, vacant receptacles for the light of 1,000 distant windows. He had everything he was supposed to want, yet he owned nothing that truly mattered. This life, this meticulously constructed fortress, felt less like a home and more like an elegant prison. He hadn't chosen it. He had simply been good at the prerequisite steps, and one step had led to the next until he found himself on the 47th floor, wondering when he had ever made a conscious decision to climb so high. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, a crack in the sterile perfection of his world. It was from a solicitor in a small coastal town he'd never heard of. Port Blossom. His great-uncle, Arthur Vance, had passed away. Elias barely remembered him, a wild-haired, smiling man from faint childhood memories. The family's eccentric black sheep who had traded a promising academic career for a life of, as his father put it, glorified carpentry. Arthur had left him everything, not money, the solicitor clarified, much to the audible disappointment of Elias's father on a later call. No, Arthur's legacy was his cottage and his workshop. Just sell it. His father had advised, liquidate the assets. It's what he should have done 30 years ago. The advice was logical. It was what Elias, the analyst, would have told any client. An illiquid, sentimental asset in a remote location, convert it to cash, reinvest. OPTIMISE. 2 weeks later, Elias stood in front of the cottage in Port Blossom. The air, thick with the scent of salt and damp earth, was an assault on his city-scrubbed senses. The cottage was small, crooked, covered in ivy that seemed to be holding the stone walls together. Beside it stood a larger wooden structure. The workshop, a key, ancient and iron, felt heavy and real in his hand. He pushed the workshop door open. A wave of scent washed over him, so potent it made him dizzy. Sawdust, turpentine, old wood, and something else, something warm and resinous, like a forest floor in summer. Sunlight streamed through a dusty skylight, illuminating a cathedral of organized chaos. Tools of every shape and size hung from the walls, their metal surfaces gleaming, their wooden handles worn smooth by a lifetime of use. Half-finished wooden bodies of cellos and violins lay on workbenches like sleeping animals, with shavings curled like golden ribbons on the floor. In the center of the room, on a special cradle, rested a cello. It was nearly complete, its spruce, top and maple back glowing with a nascent inner light, but it was silent, unstrung, its neck unfinished, its scroll only half-carved, a tag hanging from one of the tuning pegs read, in a spidery hand, for Elias. For the next few days, Elias tried to be the analyst. He called a local realtor, a cheerful woman named Clara, who promised to find a buyer for the unique property. He made spreadsheets on his laptop, calculating potential returns, factoring in property taxes and closing costs. But his focus kept drifting. He found himself wandering the workshop, running his hands over the tools, feeling the impossible smoothness of a plain piece of maple. He discovered Arthur's journals, stacks of them, filled not with numbers, but with sketches, with thoughts on the resonant properties of different woods, with philosophical musings. They call it dead wood. One entry read, "But they are wrong. A tree has a second life when it becomes an instrument. It holds the memory of every season it endured, every storm that bent its branches. The luthier's job is not to create a voice, but to release the one that is already there. You listen. You follow the grain. You surrender to the material. Elias read for hours, devoured the words. Arthur's prose was like his workshop, chaotic, passionate, yet underpinned by a profound and patient wisdom. He wrote of life not as a ladder to be climbed, but as a piece of wood to be understood. You couldn't force it into a shape it wasn't meant to have. You had to work with its nature, with its knots and imperfections, to find the beauty within. The words echoed in the silent spaces of Elias's soul. He looked at his hands, pale and smooth, hands that manipulated data and signed contracts. They felt foreign, useless in this temple of tangible creation. On an impulse, he picked up a carving knife and a scrap piece of wood. He tried to mimic a curve he'd seen in a drawing. The knife slipped, gouging the wood and slicing his thumb. He swore, dropping the tool. The blood, bright red against the pale wood, was a shock of color in his monochrome existence. It was real. The pain was real. He hadn't felt something so simple and direct in years. He wrapped his thumb clumsily and, instead of giving up, he picked up the knife again. Clara, the realtor, called a week later. She had a buyer, a developer from the city who loved the rustic charm and planned to tear down the workshop to build a modern holiday rental. It's a very generous cash offer, Miss Vance, all cash, quick close. You wouldn't even have to come back. This was it, the logical exit, the clean transaction that would restore order to his life. He could return to his fortress on the 47th floor. The strange interlude in Port Blossom, nothing more than an anecdote. He pictured his office, the glow of his multiple monitors, the hum of the servers. For the first time, the image didn't bring a sense of power, but of suffocation. He imagined the developer's bulldozers tearing through the workshop walls, crushing the tools, splintering the sleeping instruments. He thought of the unfinished cello, its voice forever trapped inside. Mr. Vance, are you there? Clara's voice crackled on the line. Elias looked at his bandaged thumb. He looked at the cello, waiting patiently in its cradle. He took a breath, the air tasting of sawdust and salt. I'm sorry, Clara, he said, his own voice sounding unfamiliar to him. The property is no longer for sale. The silence that followed his call was different. It wasn't empty. It was filled with a terrifying, exhilarating sense of possibility. The next call he made was to his boss. He requested an indefinite leave of absence. The confusion and irritation on the other end of the line was palpable. But for the first time in a decade, Elias didn't care about someone else's expectations. He was staying. He was going to finish the cello. It was a foolish, irrational decision, a complete betrayal of the man he had been, and it was the first true choice he had ever made. The beginning was a study in humility. He was clumsy, impatient. He ruined several pieces of expensive wood. His hands, accustomed to the delicate tap of a keyboard, ached and blistered. There were days of profound frustration where he would sit on the workshop floor, surrounded by his failures, the smell of splintered maple mocking him, the silence of the unfinished cello a constant judgment. He lived on his savings, his life shrinking in material terms as it expanded in every other way. He swapped tailored suits for flannel shirts, Michelin-starred restaurants for simple meals of bread and cheese bought from the village store. He started talking to people. Lena, the owner of the local cafe, who had known Arthur for years, would bring him coffee and stories about his uncle. An old fisherman named Samuel showed him how to read the weather in the clouds, slowly, painstakingly. He learned to listen, as Arthur's journals instructed. He learned to feel the tension in the wood, to read the map of its grain. He spent a month just sharpening the tools, learning the precise angle of the blade for a plane, the perfect curve for a gouge. The work was meditative. Each scrape of the plane, each curl of the chisel, required his entire presence, his mind. Once a frantic hive of market data, grew quiet, focused on the single point where steel met wood. He was no longer the analyst observing the world from a glass tower. He was a participant, covered in sweat and sawdust, engaged in a conversation with a piece of a tree. He was shaping it, but it was also shaping him. The hollow spaces inside him began to fill, not with numbers, but with the satisfaction of a perfect, seamless joint, the sweet scent of varnish, the quiet pride of creation. The day he finally strung the cello felt monumental. His hands, now calloused and strong, moved with a newfound confidence. He fitted the bridge, tightened the pegs, the strings stretching over the fingerboard like new tendons. The instrument was complete. It was beautiful, its varnish deep and rich, the grain of the wood a flowing river of light and shadow. What its true purpose was yet to be revealed. He didn't know how to play. Lena, seeing his nervous hesitation, made a call. The next evening, an elderly woman appeared at his door. Her name was Isabel, and she had been the principal cellist in a symphony orchestra for 40 years. Before retiring to Port Blossom, she walked into the workshop, her eyes taking in everything. She approached the cello not as an object, but with the reverence one affords a living thing. She sat down, settled the instrument against her, and drew her bow across the strings. The first note was deep and resonant, a sound that seemed to come from the very earth beneath the workshop. It filled the space, vibrating in Elias's bones, in the wooden beams of the ceiling, in the glass of the windows. It was a voice full of sorrow and joy, of wine-swept coastlines and ancient forests, of a lifetime of patient work. Isabel played on, a slow, mournful Bach suite, and the cello sang. It sang of Arthur's quiet passion and of Elias's struggle and discovery. It was the sound of a life released. Tears streamed down Elias's face. They weren't tears of sadness or happiness, but of recognition in the voice of the cello. He finally heard his own. He never went back to the 47th floor. His old life was sold off piece by piece, the car, the apartment, the expensive watches. It was just a liquidation of assets after all. He stayed in Port Blossom, in the crooked cottage by the sea. He was no master luthier, not yet. He was an apprentice with a lifetime of learning ahead of him. His new life wasn't one of wealth or prestige. It was a small, quiet life measured in the curl of wood shavings and the slow drying of varnish. Sometimes, late at night, he would stand outside his workshop and look up at the stars, a spray of infinite, chaotic light so different from the rigid grid of the city. He was no longer a stranger in his own life. The fortress of glass had been dismantled, replaced by a simple structure of wood and stone, built not by accident or expectation, but with his own hands, and it was, finally, a home.